The strange thing about giant sloths is not that some grew as large as elephants. It is that Earth had room for them. Plants, predators, weather, and early humans all moved through a world where a slow, heavy animal could shape the land simply by existing. Then that weight disappeared, and the world kept going without it. What did Earth feel like when those giant footsteps still belonged here? Before we imagine Earth with giant sloths still walking, we have to make one quiet adjustment in the mind. This was not a fantasy planet. It was our planet. The same Earth, under the same moon, with rivers finding low ground, wind moving through grass, rain softening soil, and animals leaving prints that would sometimes outlast their bodies. But the scale of life felt different. In parts of the Americas, long before modern towns, farms, highways, or fences, the land could hold animals so large that their presence changed the meaning of distance. A giant ground sloth was not hanging from a branch in a warm forest like the small tree sloths people know today. It walked on the ground. It carried a heavy body through open country, woodland edges, dry basins, caves, valleys, and plant-rich places that gave it enough food to keep moving. Some ground sloths were smaller, some were enormous. The largest forms, such as Megatherium, belonged to a world where an animal related to modern sloths could reach a size that feels almost misplaced beside the gentle image of a slow creature in a tree. Yet in that older world, it was not misplaced. It belonged to the pattern of the land. To ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked is not only to ask what the animal looked like, it is to ask what kind of Earth could feed it, shelter it, tolerate it, and remember it in bone, dung, claw marks, and footprints after it was gone. The late Ice Age world was not one simple frozen scene. It was a shifting Earth. And in News of Reader, there were cold regions, dry grasslands, forests, wetlands, deserts, river corridors, and seasonal landscapes that changed over thousands of years. In some places, ice held the northern lands. In others, plants grew under skies that were cooler or drier than today. The world was alive with large bodies. Mammoths, mastodons, ancient horses, camels, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, glyptodonts, and many other animals shared different parts of the continents. Giant sloths were one branch of this larger megafaunal world, not an isolated wonder. Their bodies made sense because the ecosystem around them still had room for such weight. A slow animal could survive when its size, claws, feeding habits, and cautious movements fit the pressures around it. It did not need to be fast in the way a deer is fast. It did not need to vanish into trees like a small modern sloth. Its life was written in another grammar. Heavy steps, strong limbs, long claws, patient feeding, and a body that could reach vegetation other animals might not use in the same way. Imagine a quiet morning on that earth. The air is cool. The ground is damp where night has settled into the soil. Low plants bend under beads of water. Somewhere near a stand of trees, a large ground sloth moves slowly, not as a monster and not as a myth, but as a living mammal making ordinary choices. It smells leaves. It shifts its weight. It may rise partly on its hind legs to reach higher branches, using its tail and powerful body for balance. Around it, smaller animals keep their distance. Birds call from brush. Insects move through dead wood. A predator far away reads the landscape through scent and sound. Nothing in this scene knows it is prehistoric. Nothing knows it will become a museum skeleton, a fossil layer, or a question asked by people thousands of years later. This is one of the coldest truths about the past. The creatures inside it were not symbols, they were simply alive. The giant sloth did not walk for us to discover it. It walked because it was hungry, because the season had changed, because the next patch of food was somewhere beyond the last one. And Earth, for a long time, allowed that slow movement to continue. When we picture this world, we should avoid making it too dramatic. The most important feeling may be not terror, but spaciousness. There was space for large animals to wander, space for plants to grow back after being browsed, space for bones to fall unnoticed, space for human beings, later in the story to enter landscapes that were already ancient before them. The giant sloth's earth was not empty. It was crowded with relationships, many of them quiet. A footprint pressed into mud was connected to the weight of a body. That body was connected to plants. Those plants were connected to rain, soil, climate, insects, seeds, and seasons. The animal was not separate from the world it crossed. It was one of the ways the world moved. To understand that older Earth, it helps to slow down and remove the sharp borders that modern life has placed across the land. Today, many people know the world through roads, maps, property lines, lights, and named places. A forest ends at a road, a field ends at a fence, a river is crossed by a bridge. But when giant ground sloths still walked, much of the land was connected in ways that are hard to feel now. A valley did not stop because a human boundary said it stopped. A grassland did not end because someone had measured it. A wooded slope, a dry basin, a patch of shrubs, and a riverbank could all belong to the same living root. For a large animal, the world was not a collection of separate places. It was a long surface of smells, food, water, shelter, danger, and memory. Giant sloths moved through that surface slowly, but slowness did not mean weakness. Their lives were shaped by patience. A large ground sloth could not live like a small bird, darting from branch to branch. It could not live like a fast herd animal, depending on sudden flight across open ground. Its body asked something else from the earth. It needed enough vegetation to support a heavy frame. It needed landscapes where moving slowly could still be successful. It needed seasons that, at least for a time, gave more than they took away. This is why the title question is really larger than one animal. What was Earth like when giant sloths still walked? It was an Earth where slowness could be enormous, where survival did not always belong to speed, and where a heavy browser could be part of the ordinary balance of a place. The giant sloth's body tells us this quietly. Strong limbs, curved claws, a powerful build, and teeth suited for plant material point toward an animal that met the world through feeding, reaching, pulling, digging, and steady movement. Scientists do not have to imagine every detail from nothing. Fossils, preserved dung in dry caves, trackways, and related living animals all give clues, though each clue has limits. A bone can show shape and attachment points for muscles. A footprint can show that a body passed through wet ground. Preserved dung can carry traces of diet and environment, but none of these things gives the whole animal back. The living creature is gone. What remains is enough to guide us, but not enough to justify pretending certainty about every hour of its life. That is important for this story, because the world of giant sloths should not be turned into a cartoon of giants roaming everywhere at once. There were different kinds of ground sloths, in different regions, at different times. Some were far larger than others. Some lived in North America, some in South America, and their habitats were not identical. The Earth they walked through was not one stage with one backdrop. It was a continent-scale mosaic, changing with climate, elevation, rainfall, vegetation, and time. In one region, a ground sloth might have moved through dry southwestern landscapes where caves preserved traces of its passing. In another, a much larger relative might have belonged to South American plains or open woodland. The important point is not to flatten them into one simple creature. The important point is to see what their existence means. The Americas once held a greater range of large mammals than they do now, and giant sloths were part of that lost range. Picture the land without modern noise, no engines, no distant electrical hum, no straight line of headlights cutting the dark. The night would not be silent, but its sounds would come from weather, insects, water, and animals. A large sloth moving near brush might make only small sounds compared with its size. The crush of leaves, the drag of claws, the shifting of soil under weight. Its presence would be felt more than announced. In the morning, the sign of it might remain in bent branches, disturbed ground, and prints drying at the edge of mud. Other animals would read those signs without naming them. A predator might notice. A smaller herbivore might avoid the freshest trail. Seeds might cling, fall, pass through, or settle elsewhere. A body this large did not simply occupy space, it carried influence through space. That is the quiet center of this first part of the journey. Earth with giant sloths was not just Earth plus one strange animal. It was Earth with different pressures, different paths, different plant relationships, and different possibilities for large life. When those animals walked, the ground itself was participating in a slower rhythm, and for a long time, that rhythm was normal. A world big enough for giant sloths was also a world still being shaped by the end of the Ice Age. This does not mean every place was covered in ice, or that every day was frozen and harsh. The late Pleistocene was more varied than that. Ice sheets held some northern regions, while farther south there were grasslands, woodlands, wetlands, deserts, river valleys, and open plains where animals followed food, water, shelter, and season. Giant ground sloths belonged to this changing earth, not as accidents, but as animals shaped by long evolutionary history. Their relatives had lived in the Americas for millions of years, and by the time humans began entering and moving through parts of these landscapes, ground sloths were already old members of the world. This matters because it changes the feeling of the story. Humans did not step into an empty wilderness waiting to be named. They entered places that already had trails, feeding grounds, dens, nesting sites, migration paths, and hidden animal knowledge written into the land. A giant sloth moving through brush was part of that older order. It may have browsed on leaves, stems, shrubs, or other plant material depending on the species and place. It may have used its claws to pull vegetation closer or to defend itself when necessary. It may have rested in sheltered places, passed through open ground at a careful pace, and left behind signs that other living things responded to without any need for human language. The more we slow down, the less the animal feels like a strange decoration in prehistory. It becomes a way of measuring the earth itself. If a landscape can support a heavy plant eater for generation after generation, then that landscape has depth. It has enough plant growth, enough seasonal return, enough space between dangers, and enough time for a large, slow body to make sense. That is why the giant sloth is useful for thinking about the old earth. It tells us not only that animals were bigger, but that relationships were arranged differently. The plants were not merely background. The soil was not merely floor. A riverbank was not merely scenery. Each of these things helped decide where a giant sloth could live, where it could not live, and how far its quiet influence could reach. In some dry caves, preserved dung from ground sloths has helped scientists understand what they ate and where they lived. In places like White Sands, fossil trackways preserve moments when ground sloths and humans crossed the same ancient landscape, though the meaning of every track must be interpreted carefully. In museums, bones show the strength and shape of bodies that no person alive has ever seen moving. These are not complete windows into the past, they are small openings. But when placed together, they show an earth where very large mammals were not rare miracles. They were part of the structure of life. To imagine that structure, we should let the scene remain calm. A giant sloth stands near low trees in pale afternoon light. Its long claws are not weapons raised for drama, but tools of a body built for reaching, pulling, balancing, and surviving. Its fur catches dust. Its breath slows in the cool air. Nearby, other animals continue their own lives. A horse-like animal grazes at a distance. A bird lifts from the grass. A predator may be somewhere beyond sight. But the scene is not only about fear. Most life is not a chase. Most life is feeding, listening, resting, moving a little farther, and enduring one more season. Earth, then, was not louder in a simple way. It was heavier with bodies, with tracks, with dung, with bones, with plants bent under use, with paths that had never been drawn on a map. When giant sloths still walked, the ground carried a different memory each day. Some of that memory vanished with rain. Some was pressed deeper into mud. Some became fossil, and some, much later, became the quiet question that guides this whole story. What kind of world can lose such enormous footsteps and still look, at first glance, complete? To understand what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked, we need to meet the animal without the wrong picture in our minds. A giant ground sloth was not simply a modern tree sloth made larger. That image is easy to imagine, but it leads us in the wrong direction. Modern sloths live mostly in trees, with bodies shaped for hanging, climbing, and moving slowly through branches. Giant ground sloths belong to the same broad family story, but their lives were written on the ground. They walked across soil, mud, rock, grass, dry earth, and forest edges. Their bodies were built for weight, reach, and strength, not for disappearing into the canopy. Some were only large compared with modern animals. Others were truly massive. Megatherium, one of the most famous giant ground sloths, was among the largest, with a size often compared to an elephant. But even that fact should be held gently. Giant sloth was not one single creature. It was a common name people use for several extinct ground-dwelling sloths, spread across different regions and times in the Americas. Some lived in South America, some lived in North America. Some, like the Shasta ground sloth, were much smaller than Megatherium, though still large enough to make a modern person pause if it stood nearby. This variety matters because it keeps the story honest. When we ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked, we are not asking about one animal in one place. We are asking about a wider lost world where many kinds of ground sloths formed part of the landscape. Their closest living relatives are not elephants, bears, or apes, even if their size can make the mind reach for those comparisons. They belong to a group of mammals that includes modern sloths, anteaters, and armadillos. That connection is quiet but important. It tells us that giant ground sloths were not monsters outside nature. They were part of a real evolutionary line, shaped over deep time in the Americas. Their bones show a strange mixture of familiarity and distance. There is the sloth connection, but the body is no longer the small, branch-hanging animal we know from tropical forests. There is a heavy pelvis, strong limbs, long claws, and a build that suggests an animal able to pull vegetation, brace itself, and move with great deliberate force. Some reconstructions show ground sloths capable of rising partly on their hind legs, using the tail as support, especially when feeding. This does not mean they were standing upright like people, and it does not mean every species behaved in the same way. It simply means their anatomy gives us clues about how a large plant-eating mammal might have reached food and balanced its body. The claws are one of the details that can easily become dramatic in the imagination. They were long, curved, and powerful, but they were not there, only for violence. In animals, a body part usually has many ordinary uses. Claws can help pull branches closer. They can help dig, tear, hold, brace, or defend. A giant sloth's claws belong to daily life before they belong to any dramatic scene. This is one reason the animal feels so interesting for a sleep story. Its strangeness is not loud. It is slow, physical, and grounded. A giant ground sloth did not need to be a predator to shape the world around it. It only needed to eat, move, rest, leave waste, break branches, disturb soil, and pass through the same places again and again. A heavy herbivore can change a landscape without intending to. It can open paths. It can affect which plants survive browsing. It can move nutrients through dung. It can become food after death for scavengers, insects, microbes, and soil. In this way, the giant sloth's identity was not only in its skeleton, it was in the relationships its body created. If we strip away the exaggerated image, what remains is more powerful. A slow mammal, related to living sloths, built for the ground, varied across species, and large enough in some forms to remind us that Earth once carried a different scale of life as something ordinary. If we look more closely at a giant ground sloth, the first thing we should notice is how much of its life was built around contact with the Earth. A modern tree sloth is shaped by branches, hanging, gripping, and conserving energy high above the ground. A ground sloth was shaped by weight. Its feet, limbs, hips, claws, tail, and head all belonged to an animal that met the world from below, not from the canopy. This difference changes the whole feeling of the creature. It was not a lazy animal made huge. It was a large mammal that had found another way to live slowly. Some ground sloths may have walked with the outer sides of their front feet turned in, partly because long claws made a flat-footed walk difficult. That kind of movement can look strange to us, but it was not a mistake. It was the body solving its own problem. The claws were useful, but they also shaped how the animal carried itself. The heavy limbs supported a body that could not afford careless motion. Every step had to carry mass, balance, and intention. When a large ground sloth moved through soft soil, its body pressed information into the ground. When it crossed dry brush, it may have pushed vegetation aside. When it fed, it may have pulled plants down toward its mouth rather than climbing toward them. In this way, anatomy becomes a quiet map of behavior. We should still be careful. Bones do not tell us every movement, and different species did not all live exactly the same way. But bones can tell us enough to avoid the wrong story. A giant ground sloth was not built for speed first. It was built for strength, reach, endurance, and a slow negotiation with plants. Its skull and teeth suggest an animal deeply tied to vegetation, though diets could vary by species and place. Some researchers even suggested that certain extinct sloths may not have been strictly plant eaters in every circumstance. But for a calm and truthful picture, it is safest to understand ground sloths mainly as herbivorous or plant-focused mammals, with details depending on the species. This matters because the earth they walk through was, in part, a food landscape. Leaves, shrubs, grasses, tough stems, dry plants, moist plants, seasonal growth, and woodland edges were not background decoration. They were the reason a slow body could continue. Imagine one standing beside low trees. It does not leap, it does not rush. It shifts its weight through the hips and hind legs. The tail may help brace the body. The forelimbs reach, the claws pull. The head lowers, then rises. The animal feeds not like a machine, but like a large living body, making small decisions. This branch, not that one. This patch, then another. This sheltered place. Then the next open stretch. The face would not need to look fierce to be impressive. Its power would come from scale and patience. Even the name Megatherium, often translated as great beast, can make the mind expect something violent. But most of its hours, like most hours in nature, would have been ordinary. Feeding, resting, moving, sensing, avoiding danger when possible, enduring weather, leaving signs behind. This ordinary life is what makes the animal more real. If it were only a monster, it would belong to fantasy, because it was an eater of plants, a maker of tracks, a carrier of dung, a body that aged, tired, healed, and eventually died. It belongs to Earth. Different ground sloths filled different spaces in this older world. The Shasta ground sloth of North America was large, but far smaller than the most famous giant forms of South America. Other kinds had their own sizes, ranges, and habits. Their variety reminds us that the past was not a single exhibit. It was a living spread of animals, adapting to different climates and landscapes across deep time. When giant sloths still walked, Earth was not simply showing off enormous creatures. It was holding a set of relationships in which even a slow animal could become large, and even a large animal could live by patience rather than pursuit. That is the picture we need before we go farther. Not a creature outside nature, but a grounded mammal whose whole body tells us that the ancient Americas once allowed slowness to become immense. The more clearly we see the giant ground sloth, the more the old Earth begins to change shape around it. It was not a dinosaur, though people sometimes place all extinct giants into one loose corner of the imagination. It was not a bear, though a standing ground sloth might have seemed bear-like from a distance. It was not an elephant, even when the largest species reached a size that invites that comparison. It was a mammal from a different branch of life, related to sloths, anteaters, and armadillos, carrying a history rooted deeply in the Americas. That is one reason it feels so strange and so important. A giant ground sloth reminds us that evolution does not move toward one expected form. It experiments through time with bodies that fit particular worlds. In one world, a small sloth can hang quietly from a tree. In another, a distant relative can walk on the ground with a body heavy enough to press deep tracks into mud. Both are real. Both belong to the same broad story, but they tell very different truths about the earth around them. The giant ground sloth's truth was scale without speed. It was strength without a predator's teeth. It was slowness made large enough to matter across a landscape. When we think of ancient animals, we often imagine danger first. Teeth, claws, pursuit, attack. But for many large animals, the center of life was not attack. It was food. A ground sloth needed plants, and because some species were large, the need for plants tied them to broad spaces and steady supply. A single animal's day may have been simple. Feed, rest, move, listen, avoid trouble, return to food. Yet that simple day connected it to climate, rainfall, soil, vegetation, and season. If a dry period changed plant growth, the animal would feel it. If a forest edge shifted, the animal's route might shift. If a water source disappeared, movement would change. This is why knowing what a giant ground sloth was also helps us understand what Earth was like when it walked. The animal was not separate from the conditions that supported it. Its body was almost a question written in flesh. Is there enough space here, enough vegetation here, enough time here for slowness to survive at this size? For many thousands of years, in many places, the answer was yes. Fossils tell us part of this answer, but they speak slowly. A skeleton shows the architecture of a body, not the full warmth of a life. Preserved dung can reveal traces of diet, but not the whole day that produced it. Trackways can preserve movement, but not every intention behind that movement. This is why a truthful story about giant sloths must stay humble. We can say they were ground-dwelling mammals. We can say different species lived in different parts of the Americas. We can say some were very large, while others were smaller but still impressive compared with most living mammals today. We can say they were mainly tied to plant feeding, with details varying by species and environment. But we should not pretend to know every sound they made, every social habit they had, or every choice they faced in every landscape. The past gives evidence, not complete possession. Still, even the evidence we have is enough to make the world feel wider. Imagine finding a trace in a cave, dry enough to preserve what should have disappeared. Imagine a footprint hardened into the memory of an ancient surface. Imagine bones assembled in a museum, not as a monster, but as a quiet proof that the Americas once held bodies now missing from the living world. The giant ground sloth was real in this patient way. It was real through weight, through feeding, through movement, through remains that survived long after fur, breath, and muscle were gone. By the end of this second step in the journey, we can leave behind the simple picture of a huge, lazy animal. What remains is more exact and more interesting. A family of extinct ground sloths, some enormous, some more modest, all belonging to landscapes that no longer operate in quite the same way. To meet them honestly is to meet an Earth where the ground carried different kinds of life, where slow movement could still be powerful, and where a creature did not need to be fast, fierce, or loud to become one of the great shapes of its time. The landscapes giant sloths walked through were not one single world. They were many worlds held together by time. If we imagine only a frozen ice age plain, we lose too much. If we imagine only warm forest, we lose too much again. Ground sloths lived across wide parts of the Americas, and their traces appear in places that tell different stories. Dry caves, open basins, wooded edges, ancient lake margins, grasslands, and regions where climate shifted slowly across generations. This variety is important because the question is not only what the animal was, but what Earth was like around it. A giant sloth needed a landscape that could support a large plant-eating body, yet that support could come in different forms. In one place there might be shrubs, desert plants, and dry shelter. In another there might be richer woodland, river valleys, and seasonal growth. The old Earth was not simple. It was a mosaic, and the giant sloth moved through that mosaic as one of its heavy, quiet pieces. Picture a broad valley in late afternoon. The air is cooler than it would be in many of the same places today. The light falls across grasses, low trees, and patches of bare soil. A watercourse cuts through the land, not wide enough to dominate the scene, but important enough to gather tracks along its edges. Animals come there because water organizes life. A giant ground sloth approaching such a place would not be separate from the valley. Its route would be shaped by slope, scent, plant cover, and the distance to safety. Its body would press into mud. Its claws might leave marks where the ground was soft. If it fed near the water, broken stems and disturbed plants might remain after it moved on. Nothing about this needs drama. The landscape itself is the story. It gives the animal a place to be large. It gives the body something to eat, somewhere to rest, and a surface on which its passing can sometimes be preserved. In drier parts of North America, the Shasta ground sloth left evidence that helps scientists reconstruct parts of its life, including preserved dung in caves. Such remains are humble, but they are valuable because they connect the animal directly to place. A bone can travel after death. A skeleton can be scattered. But dung preserved in a dry cave points to a creature using that environment, eating plants from that region, and living within the limits of that local world. It reminds us that the giant sloth's earth was not only seen in grand views, it was also held in small details: chewed plant material, dry shelter, dust, mineral-rich soil, and the repeating use of a place over time. The animal's world had textures. There was rough bark, thorny brush, gritty ground, damp mud, dry cave floors, cold night air, and the smell of plants under seasonal stress. The animal did not know these things as scientific categories. It knew them through its body. It knew where walking was easy and where it was costly. It knew where food could be reached and where hunger might begin. It knew danger through sound and scent. The earth it walked through was therefore not a backdrop, but a field of decisions. Every slow movement meant the landscape was being read. This is why the old world feels so different from ours. Today, many large animals are confined to protected areas, fragmented habitats, or human-managed spaces. But when giant sloths still walked, the scale of movement could be broader, and the land was not yet organized around modern human control. That does not mean it was peaceful or untouched. Climate was changing. Predators existed. Early humans would eventually share some of these same landscapes. Food was seasonal, death was always present, but the land still held relationships that modern people rarely see at full scale. A slow giant could browse near a river, pass through brush, leave dung in a sheltering cave, and move across open ground beneath a sky with no artificial light. The world was not empty. It was full of paths made by bodies, and the giant sloth was one of the bodies large enough to make the earth remember. A landscape is not only a shape seen from above. For a giant ground sloth, it was something felt through the feet, mouth, nose, skin, and weight of the body. A dry valley was not just dry. It meant tougher plants, longer distances between water, more careful movement through exposed ground, and shelter that mattered when the sun was high or the night turned cold. A wooded edge was not simply a line between trees and open land. It was a feeding place, a hiding place, a place where branches could be reached, where leaves changed with season, where the animal's claws and strength could become useful in ordinary ways. A cave was not only a dark hole in stone. In some regions, it could preserve traces that open ground would erase: dung, plant fragments, hair, dust, and the repeated signs of animals using shelter across long stretches of time. When we ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked, we are really asking what kind of places could hold such daily needs without breaking the pattern. The answer is not one perfect habitat. It is many different habitats, each offering a different bargain. In the American Southwest, the Shasta ground sloth is often connected with dry caves and arid landscapes, where preserved dung has helped reveal parts of its diet and surroundings. In South America, larger relatives belong to different environments, including open or semi-open regions where a much heavier body could still find enough plant life to survive. The old Americas were not uniform. They were a wide arrangement of climates and plant communities, and ground sloths did not all answer them in the same way. This is why the story must stay patient. A giant sloth in one region should not be imagined as living exactly like a giant sloth in another. The earth beneath them changed from place to place. In some places, grass and low shrubs may have mattered more. In others, leaves, woody plants, or mixed vegetation may have shaped feeding. Some landscapes were dry enough to keep fragile evidence from disappearing. Others were wet enough to destroy nearly everything except bone. What remains in the fossil record is therefore uneven. It tells us a real story, but not a complete one. The silence between traces is part of the past too. Imagine the animal moving along a slope near evening. The ground is not smooth. There are stones, roots, soft patches, old animal paths, and places where rain has cut small channels into the soil. A modern person might see a rough stretch of land. The animal would experience it as cost and possibility. A heavy step on soft earth takes effort. A reachable branch offers food. A sheltered hollow offers rest. A dry ridge catches wind and scent. A muddy edge near water records movement for a little while before drying, cracking, or being covered again. Every feature of the landscape becomes meaningful when a body depends on it. This is what makes giant sloths such useful guides into the old earth. They force us to think at ground level, not only about ice sheets and climate maps, but about where a slow animal could place its feet, where it could feed, where it could avoid danger, and where its remains might survive long enough for us to find them. Their world was not designed for them, but they fitted into it. For a long time, their lives passed through places that were changing, but still workable. Plants returned after browsing, water gathered and disappeared. Predators moved through their own routes. Early humans, in some times and places, would later cross the same larger stage. But before any human explanation, there was the animal and the land. A ground sloth did not need to understand a valley to belong to it. It belonged through use, through repeated steps, through hunger answered by plants, through shelter chosen by instinct, through dung left behind, seeds moved, branches broken, and soil disturbed. In this way, the landscapes they walked through were not passive scenery. They were active partners in the giant sloth's existence. Earth, at that time, was a place where such partnerships could still produce enormous, slow lives. The landscapes of giant sloths also had a rhythm that modern eyes can easily miss. They were not fixed pictures. A valley that looked generous in one season could become sparse in another. A riverbank that offered soft plants after rain could become hard and exposed during dry months. A wooded edge could shift slowly as climate changed, as fire moved through, as animals browsed, and as young plants either survived or disappeared. For a giant ground sloth, Earth was not simply large, it was changing. The animal's life depended on whether that change remained slow enough and forgiving enough for a heavy body to keep finding what it needed. This is one of the quiet truths behind the title. When giant sloths still walked, Earth was not a stable paradise filled with endless food. It was a living system under pressure, but it had not yet lost the conditions that allowed many great mammals to remain. The old Americas held open ground, brush, dry shelter, lake edges, forest margins, and cooler climates in different combinations. In such places, a ground sloth could move through a world that was neither fully forest nor fully plain, neither purely cold nor purely warm. Its life happened in the in-between spaces where plants, water, distance, and shelter met. Imagine a broad landscape after a season of rain. Low vegetation has returned in patches, the air carries the smell of damp soil, hoofed animals have crossed the mud, birds pick through shallow water. Farther away, a large ground sloth moves near the edge of shrubs, slow enough that its motion seems almost part of the afternoon. Its body does not hurry the scene. It changes it by being there. A branch bends, leaves disappear, Soil compresses under a foot. Dung falls where insects, microbes, seeds, and time will begin their own smaller work. The animal continues, and behind it the landscape is slightly different, not dramatically different, just touched, used, and altered. That is how many large herbivores shape Earth. Not through one spectacular event, but through ordinary repetition. Day after day, season after season, body after body, the land remembers pressure. The giant sloth's world must be understood this way, through repeated contact. A single footprint can feel poetic to us now, but for the animal it was only a step. A cave deposit can feel like a treasure to scientists, but for the sloth it may have been only shelter, rest, or passage. A fossil bone can hold our attention for centuries, but once it was part of a warm body moving through weather, the landscapes they walked through were full of such ordinary moments, most of them never preserved. Rain erased many tracks, scavengers scattered remains, plants grew over old paths, rivers cut through sediment and carried the past away. What survives is rare, and because it is rare, it can make the old world seem emptier than it was. But the evidence we do have points toward a fuller Earth, one where ground sloths belong to a wider company of large mammals, and where their habitats varied across the Americas. This does not mean giant sloths were everywhere. It means that in the places where they lived, the landscape had enough continuity to support them. Enough food, enough space, enough shelter, enough time. That phrase, enough time, may be the most important. Large animals usually need generations of stability to become part of a place. Their bodies are not quick experiments, they are long answers. A giant ground sloth standing near a river or resting near a cave carried the result of deep evolutionary time into a single quiet moment. The land around it carried the same depth. Old soils, old plant communities, old climates shifting slowly through the centuries. By the end of this third view of the landscape, the Earth of giant sloths should feel less like a backdrop and more like a relationship. The animal was shaped by the land, and the land was touched by the animal. Neither can be understood alone. When we ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked, the answer begins here. It was a world where size, slowness, plants, weather, soil, and distance still fit together well enough for enormous footsteps to be ordinary. A giant ground sloth lived in a world where being large did not mean being safe. Size changed the terms of danger, but it did not remove danger from the Earth. This is important to understand gently, because the animal can seem almost untouchable when we picture its heavy body, long claws, and powerful limbs. Some ground sloths were enormous. Even the smaller well-known forms, such as the Shasta ground sloth, were large enough to stand far beyond the size of most animals a person meets today. But the late Pleistocene was not a quiet park made for peaceful giants. It was a world of hunger, weather, injury, competition, drought, cold, heat, and predators moving through the same landscapes. A slow animal could survive there, but only if slowness was supported by other strengths. For a giant ground sloth, those strengths were not the strengths of a running animal. They were the strengths of mass, reach, endurance, claws, awareness, and the ability to use the land carefully. It may be tempting to imagine every meeting between a giant sloth and a predator as a dramatic struggle, but most survival happens before any fight begins. An animal survives by choosing where to feed, when to move, where to rest, and how close to remain to shelter, cover, or uneven ground. A heavy body cannot waste energy the way a small, quick animal might. Each long movement has a cost. Each exposed place has a meaning. Each scent on the wind could matter. The old Earth, when giant sloths still walked, was therefore not just big, it was watchful. Its open spaces were not empty. Its brush was not only food. Its caves and slopes were not only scenery. They were parts of a living map in which safety and danger were always mixed. A large ground sloth feeding near trees might have had access to leaves and branches, but also less clear visibility. One crossing open ground might see farther, but also be more exposed. One resting in a sheltered place might save energy, but must still rise again, move again, and feed again. This is the slower truth of danger. It is not always an attack. Sometimes danger is the long dry season, when plants are fewer. Sometimes it is an injury in a foot or limb, making movement harder for a body that depends on steady weight. Sometimes it is a young animal not yet strong enough, or an old animal no longer able to recover easily. Sometimes it is a predator that never appears in the scene, but whose presence changes how every herbivore uses the land. The giant sloth's claws help us understand this balance. They were not only frightening objects, they were practical parts of the body. They could help pull vegetation closer. They could help brace the animal. They could perhaps help defend it if escape was not possible. But a claw does not mean an animal wanted conflict. In nature, defense is often the last. A giant ground sloth would have been better served by avoiding unnecessary danger, conserving energy, and using its size as a warning before any physical struggle. This makes it different from many smaller prey animals. It did not need to live in constant panic, but it also could not live without caution. Around it, the late Ice Age world held predators and scavengers capable of reading weakness. Saber-toothed cats, large bears, wolves, and other carnivores belong to different parts of the broader Pleistocene world. Their exact relationships with particular sloth species varied by region and evidence, so we should not force one simple scene onto all places. Still, the larger truth is fair. Giant sloths were part of ecosystems where large predators existed and where death returned bodies to the land. This is what made the old Earth so complete and so severe. Life did not float above hunger. A giant sloth was impressive, but it was still made of flesh. It still needed plants. It still needed water. It still aged. It still left tracks that others could follow. It still belonged to a world where every body, however large, was temporary. And perhaps that is why its slowness feels so powerful. It was not the slowness of ease. It was the slowness of an animal carrying great weight through a dangerous world, one careful step at a time. The danger around a giant ground sloth was not always shaped like teeth. Sometimes it was shaped like distance. A large body needs food again and again, and when the land changes, distance becomes part of survival. If the plants near a resting place are no longer enough, the animal must move. If a dry season lowers water or leaves certain shrubs bare, the animal must search farther. If a valley becomes too exposed or a slope too costly, the body must pay for every step. This is one of the quiet pressures of being huge. Size gives strength, but it also creates need. A small animal can sometimes hide inside a narrow crack, feed on little, or survive by moving quickly between tiny chances. A giant ground sloth could not live that way. Its safety was tied to broad patterns, enough plant growth, enough usable ground, enough shelter, enough time between serious threats. When Earth still held these animals, it held not only large bodies, but the conditions that made large bodies possible. That does not mean those conditions were gentle. The late Pleistocene was a changing world, and a changing world tests animals slowly. A cold period, a dry spell, a shift in vegetation, or the loss of a familiar water source might not look dramatic from one day to the next. But for an animal that depends on repeated feeding and steady movement, small changes can gather weight. A giant sloth did not need to understand climate. It would feel climate through hunger, thirst, plant quality, shade, wind, and the hardness of the ground beneath its feet. The world spoke to it through the body. A season with fewer leaves would not be an idea. It would be a longer walk. A colder night would not be a statistic. It would be breath in the air, muscles holding warmth, and the need to find shelter or endure exposure. This is why the animal's slowness should not be mistaken for simplicity. Slow life can be very precise. A ground sloth had to place a heavy body into the world in ways that worked often enough to survive. It had to find food without wasting too much energy. It had to rest without becoming too vulnerable. It had to move without injuring feet, joints, or claws that mattered to every future day. A broken limb, a deep wound, or a damaged foot could mean something very different for a heavy, slow animal than for a small, quick one. Movement itself was a lifeline. If movement became painful or impossible, the landscape would close around it. Predators belong to this same pressure, but they should be imagined with care. The Ice Age Americas included powerful carnivores in different regions and periods, yet it is not truthful to turn every giant sloth into prey in a repeated chase scene. Large adult ground sloths may have been difficult and dangerous targets. Their claws, size, and strength would have mattered. Young, sick, trapped, or old individuals may have faced different risks. Scavengers, too, would have been part of the system, because death does not end a body's role in the landscape. After a large animal dies, many smaller lives begin to use what remains. In that sense, even danger was part of Earth's wider order. It moved energy from one body into many others. But while alive, the giant sloth's best defense may often have been the ordinary wisdom of a body shaped by long experience. Do not spend strength for nothing. Do not cross open ground without need. Do not ignore scent, sound, slope, weather, or the behavior of other animals nearby. We cannot know those choices in human detail. We should not pretend the animal thought in words, but we can understand that survival is made from contact. A living creature does not survive an ecosystem from far away. It survives by touching it, smelling it, eating it, being slowed by it, being warned by it, and being changed by it. When giant sloths still walked, Earth was a place where this slow negotiation could continue across generations. A heavy herbivore could move through risk without living only in fear. It could be vulnerable and powerful at the same time. That is the paradox at the center of this part of the story. The giant sloth was large enough to seem almost safe, yet alive enough to be always exposed to the world. A slow animal in a dangerous world also changes how we think about courage. Courage, in this older Earth, was not a feeling. It was not a heroic choice. It was the simple fact of continuing with a body that could not disappear quickly. A giant ground sloth could not become invisible in grass like a small animal. It could not leap into branches like a monkey. It could not outrun every threat across open land. Its survival depended on a different agreement with the world. Be large, be strong, be careful, use the land well, and let slowness become a form of steadiness. This is why the animal's presence feels so different from many other Ice Age creatures. A horse-like animal suggests movement. A cat with long teeth suggests danger. A mammoth suggests herd, memory, and distance. But a giant ground sloth suggests wait meeting time. It suggests a body that had to trust the ground with every step. The earth around it was full of signals. The smell of a predator might drift before the predator appeared. The sound of alarm from other animals might change the meaning of a quiet place. A broken branch might be only weather, or it might be movement nearby. Mud could hold water, but it could also hold a heavy foot too long. A slope could offer food above reach, but it could also make balance harder. For a giant sloth, the world was not divided into safe and dangerous places. It was made of degrees. A place could be useful and risky at once. A riverbank gave water and plants, but also drew many animals together. A cave or shelter gave protection from weather, but also limited escape. Open ground gave visibility but exposed the body. Brush gave food but hid what was beyond it. To live slowly in such a world was to live inside constant small judgments, most of them beyond anything we can fully reconstruct. The fossil record shows us the animal's shape, traces of movement, preserved remains in special places, and sometimes the wider company of animals around it. It does not give us the full inner life of a giant sloth. Still, we can say this much with care. Its body was not poorly designed for danger. It was designed for a different kind of danger than the one speed solves. Strong limbs, heavy mass, long claws, and the ability to rear or brace may have made an adult difficult to attack. But no body is invincible. A young animal would have been smaller. An old animal would have been slower in another way. A sick or injured animal would have carried its weakness across the land like a signal. Even the strongest individual eventually became part of the food web after death. The old Earth did not waste bodies. It returned them. Scavengers, insects, microbes, soil, and plants all took part in the slow undoing of flesh. In that sense, Danger was not separate from life. It was one of the ways life moved through the system. This makes the giant sloth's world feel both harsher and more complete than the modern imagination often allows. It was not a peaceful garden of giants. It was not a constant battlefield either. It was something quieter and more truthful, a landscape where most days were ordinary, and ordinary days were still difficult enough to matter. The sloth fed because hunger returned. It rested because weight demanded rest. It moved because food and water were never fixed forever in one place. It stayed alert because the world had other hungers inside it. When we ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked, this is one of the answers we must keep. Earth was large enough to hold them, but not soft enough to protect them from everything. Their existence was not proof that the world was easy. It was proof that the world once had room for a slow, powerful animal to face danger without needing to become fast. And maybe that is why their absence feels so deep. We are not only missing a species, we are missing a way of being alive that belonged to a different balance between body, land, and time. The weight of a giant ground sloth did not end at the edge of its body. It entered the plants, the soil, the paths, the shadows beneath trees, and the small lives that followed after it. To understand Earth when giant sloths still walked, we have to stop seeing the animal as a separate shape moving across a background. A large herbivore is never only a body in a landscape. It is a force that keeps touching the landscape in quiet, repeated ways. Each meal changes a plant. Each step changes the ground. Each resting place presses down grasses or dry leaves. Each pile of dung returns material to soil, insects, microbes, and sometimes seeds. None of these changes needs to be dramatic. In fact, most of them would be almost invisible if we watched only for a few minutes. But over seasons, over generations, over the repeated movement of many animals, small pressures become part of how Earth works. A giant ground sloth feeding near shrubs might break stems that smaller animals could not break. It might pull branches downward, opening light to lower plants. It might browse in ways that changed which shoots survived and which did not. Its claws, often imagined as weapons, also belong to this practical relationship with vegetation. They could help bring food within reach, grip, pull, tear, or brace a large body as it fed. The animal was not trying to shape the world. It was only living. But living at that size meant the world around it was shaped a little. This is one of the most important ideas in the whole story, because giant sloths help us remember that ecosystems are not made only by climate and plants. They are also made by animal bodies. The ground beneath a heavy foot is different from ground crossed only by small animals. A branch used by a large browser is different from a branch left untouched. A cave floor where sloths repeatedly rested or passed through can become a place where traces accumulate. Dry caves in parts of North America preserved ground sloth dung, and such remains help scientists understand diet and environment. That is a quiet kind of evidence, but it is powerful because dung is not a grand fossil like a skull. It is daily life preserved. It says, "This animal ate here or near here. This animal digested plants from this world. This animal returned part of itself to the place it used." When giant sloths still walked, Earth carried many of these daily returns. The soil received what the body no longer needed. Insects and microbes began their small work. Nutrients moved from plant to animal and back toward the ground. A body this large was therefore part of a loop. It took from the landscape and then, without intention, gave back to it. The same was true after death. A dead giant sloth would not simply disappear from the story. Scavengers could feed, bones could weather, smaller organisms could use what remained. Minerals could return slowly to the earth. A single large body could become a temporary gathering place for many smaller lives. This is not a dark idea when spoken gently. It is one of the oldest forms of continuity. The animal lived by plants, and after death other lives continued through it. The earth of giant sloths was full of such exchanges. It was not clean or separated. It was made of use, return, decay, growth, and use again. Even movement mattered. If a large ground sloth passed through the same route again and again, it might help keep a passage open through brush. Other animals might follow easier ground. Water might settle differently in compressed soil. Seeds might be carried, dropped, buried, or disturbed. We should be careful not to claim too much for every species in every place, because direct evidence has limits. But the broader principle is sound. Large herbivores often influence vegetation, nutrient movement, and physical structure simply by feeding and moving. Giant ground sloths, as large plant-focused mammals, belong to that kind of influence. They were not just residents of the old Earth. They were participants in its maintenance. When we ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked, this is the slower answer beginning to appear. It was an Earth where plants met teeth and claws unlike those of most living animals today. It was an Earth where soil felt the pressure of bodies now missing. It was an Earth where the boundary between animal and landscape was never firm, because every living body was always borrowing from the world and returning to it. One of the quietest ways a giant ground sloth may have shaped Earth was through plants. Not by farming them, not by choosing them with any plan, but by eating, moving, and leaving traces behind. A large plant-eating mammal is always in conversation with vegetation. It removes leaves, it breaks stems, it reaches some plants more easily than others. It may avoid certain tough, bitter, or thorny growth, while returning often to places where food is easier to use. Over time, these small choices can matter. A landscape browsed by large animals is not the same as a landscape left only to wind, fire, insects, and smaller mouths. When giant sloths still walked, some plants would have grown under the repeated pressure of heavy bodies and strong claws. Some branches may have been pulled down before they grew old. Some young shoots may have been eaten before they became tall. Other plants may have benefited when browsing open space or light. We should not pretend to know every plant relationship for every ground sloth species, but we can safely say that a large herbivore does not pass through a plant community without consequence. Its hunger becomes part of the shape of the land. Its body makes certain kinds of contact possible. This is why the old Earth may have felt more textured than a simple picture of grass and trees. It was a world of bitten edges, bent shrubs, open paths, broken branches, rubbed bark, disturbed soil, and old feeding places used again when the season returned. A giant sloth did not have to move quickly to leave a pattern. In fact, slowness may have made its contact with plants more deliberate. It could remain near a patch of food, pulling, chewing, shifting, resting, and feeding again. The animal's size meant that even ordinary feeding could be heavy enough to change the small structure of a place. Beneath that feeding, another process was happening: the return of plant material to the ground. What a sloth ate did not vanish. Part of it became energy for the animal. Part of it passed through the body and returned as dung. In dry caves, preserved ground sloth dung has helped scientists study ancient diets and environments, which is a reminder that waste is not meaningless in nature. It is information. It is also material. To insects, microbes, and soil processes, dung is not waste in the human sense. It is a small deposit of nutrients, moisture, fibers, and chemical traces. It links the plant world to the animal world, and then back again. When giant sloths still walked, the ground received these returns from bodies that no longer exist. Their dung, their hair, their shed material, and eventually their bones were all part of the old Earth's circulation. This gives the giant sloth a different kind of importance. It was not only impressive because it was large, it was important because largeness changed the scale of exchange. A small animal returns small amounts. A giant animal returns more. A single body moving across a valley can carry plant material from one place to another. Seeds may pass through some animals, cling to fur, fall near resting places, or be disturbed into soil. We should speak carefully here, because the exact seed dispersal role of each extinct ground sloth cannot be fully observed today. But the wider idea is reasonable. Large herbivores can connect places that plants cannot cross by themselves. They make the landscape less still. They help turn distance into movement. Imagine a sloth feeding near a wooded edge in the cool part of the day. It pulls down leaves with slow force. It chews. It rests. Later, it moves toward a more open place, carrying inside its body the remains of that feeding. Nothing dramatic has happened. No chase, no collapse, no sudden turning point. Yet the earth has changed in tiny ways. A plant has lost leaves. A path has been pressed. Nutrients will be returned somewhere else. A branch has opened light to a lower layer of growth. The old world was made from these tiny changes, repeated by many living bodies. To ask what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked is therefore to ask what happens when a landscape includes large, slow, plant-eating weight as part of its normal rhythm. It was an Earth where vegetation did not grow in isolation. It grew under pressure, use, damage, recovery, and return. And the giant sloth, simply by needing to eat, helped write that rhythm into the ground. The ground itself was part of the giant sloth story. Not only the plants above it, not only the caves that preserved rare traces, but the ordinary surface of soil, mud, dust, stone, roots, and fallen leaves. A heavy animal changes the ground by trusting it again and again. Each step asks the same question without words. Will this surface hold me? Most of the time the answer was yes. Sometimes the ground was firm, and the animal passed with little sign. Sometimes it was wet enough to receive a print. Sometimes it dried before the print vanished. Sometimes later sediment covered it, protecting a small moment from time. This is why footprints feel so intimate. A bone tells us an animal had a body. A footprint tells us that body was once in motion. When giant sloths still walked, Earth was full of motions that were almost never preserved. The few that remain are not just scientific objects. They are evidence of weight meeting place. They tell us that the old world was walked into shape by animals now gone. Soil also felt the giant sloth in less visible ways. A large body passing through brush could press down plants and open narrow roots. Repeated use of the same area could disturb loose ground, compact soft surfaces, or help expose patches where seeds might fall. Claws could scrape or pull. Resting could flatten vegetation. Feeding could leave broken pieces to decay where they fell. These effects were local and ordinary, but ecosystems are made from local and ordinary effects repeated through time. A giant sloth did not need to transform a whole continent in one gesture. It only needed to live in the same landscape long enough for its body to become one of the pressures the land expected. That is one of the deep differences between that Earth and ours. Today, many places no longer have the full set of large animals that once disturbed, browsed, fertilized, trampled, and opened them. Some modern ecosystems may still carry traces of relationships with large animals that have vanished. Scientists sometimes call these missing roles ecological absences, though the exact effects can be difficult to measure. For giant ground sloths, we should stay careful. We cannot watch them moving through ancient plant communities. We cannot measure every seed they may have carried or every path they may have kept open. But we can understand the principle. When a large herbivore disappears, the landscape loses not only a species, but a pattern of contact. The plants no longer meet that mouth. The soil no longer receives that weight. The caves no longer gather that dung. The predators and scavengers no longer encounter that body in the same way. The world continues, but one form of pressure has gone silent. This helps us answer the title more honestly. What was Earth like when giant sloths still walked? It was an Earth where the ground still knew their weight. It was an Earth where vegetation still recovered from their browsing. It was an Earth where dung, tracks, bones, and broken plants were part of a slow exchange between body and place. It was not a perfect world, and not a simple one. It was a world where living things constantly borrowed from one another and returned what they could. A giant sloth ate plants grown from soil and weather. Its body carried that plant matter for a time. Then some of it returned to the ground. Later, the animal itself returned. In that slow circle, there is no waste in the deeper sense. There is movement, use, decay, and renewal. The giant sloth's great size makes that circle easier for us to see. But the lesson is not only about size, it is about connection. Every creature is more than its outline. A living body is a meeting place for water, minerals, plants, air, microbes, hunger, danger, and time. The giant ground sloth was one of the largest, slowest reminders of that truth in the ancient Americas. When it moved, the earth moved a little with it. When it vanished, the earth did not become empty, but it became different. And that difference is what we are still trying to understand. One fossil, one footprint, one preserved trace at a time. When humans entered the story of giant ground sloths, they did not enter a clean beginning. They entered an earth already old with animal paths, feeding grounds, hidden shelters, river crossings, dry caves, lake edges, and the slow habits of creatures that had lived there long before any human memory. This is one of the most important things to hold carefully. Humans and giant ground sloths were not simply two symbols meeting in a dramatic scene. They were living beings, sharing parts of the same changing world. In some places, the evidence is direct enough to say that humans and ground sloths overlapped in time and space. At White Sands in New Mexico, fossil trackways preserve human footprints and giant sloth tracks in the same ancient landscape, with some human footprints appearing inside sloth tracks, suggesting that people may have followed or approached the animal. But even there, the story must stay humble. A trackway can show movement, direction, and association. It can suggest interaction. It cannot tell us every intention inside the minds of the people who walked there. It cannot prove a successful hunt by itself. It cannot turn one preserved moment into the whole relationship between humans and giant sloths across the Americas. Still, the evidence is powerful because it brings the old earth down to the level of feet. A giant sloth stepped into wet ground. Later, or nearby, a human stepped through the same surface. The mud held both. For a moment, the world contained heavy claws, human toes, water, dust, and attention. That is not a legend. That is a physical trace. In central Brazil, at the Santa Helena rock shelter, modified giant ground sloth bones have been studied as possible evidence of people using sloth osteoderms, the small bony structures found in some sloth's skin, as artifacts. Researchers have argued that some of these bones were altered before fossilization, which would support the idea that humans and these animals existed within the same broader ecosystem. This kind of evidence matters because it complicates a simple story. It does not allow us to say that every meeting between humans and giant sloths was a hunt. It does not allow us to say humans ignored them either. The truth is slower. People may have watched them, tracked them, scavenged remains, hunted some individuals, used bones, learned their routes, avoided them, or simply shared the same water and sheltering landscapes without constant contact. Different places likely held different relationships. A small group of humans crossing an ancient basin in North America did not live exactly like people using a rock shelter in South America. A Shasta ground sloth did not live exactly like a larger South American ground sloth. The Americas were too wide, and the evidence too uneven, for one answer to cover everything. That is why this part of the story should feel quiet rather than sensational. Imagine early humans seeing a giant ground sloth from a distance. They would not need to see a monster. They might see food, danger, curiosity, a sign of water nearby, a possible source of bone or hide after death, or simply a powerful animal that deserved space. The animal, for its part, would not understand humans as history. It would know movement, smell, sound, approach, distance, and threat or non-threat in the immediate sense of the body. It might continue feeding, it might turn, it might move away, it might rise or brace if it felt pressed. The meeting, if it happened, would belong first to the ground, not to our later theories. This is what Earth was like when giant sloths still walked. Old animal worlds and new human footsteps could cross without the full meaning being clear to anyone inside the moment. The land did not announce that one age was ending. It simply received the prints. To share a world does not always mean to meet face to face. Humans and giant ground sloths could belong to the same landscape in many quieter ways. A person might find a track after the animal had already moved on. A group might notice broken vegetation near a water source. Someone might enter a shelter where signs of large animals were present from another season. Bones might be found after death when the living sloth was no longer there. A trackway, a modified bone, a possible artifact, or a burned fragment can show connection. But connection is not always the same as confrontation. This distinction matters because the human part of the giant sloth story is often pulled toward drama. People imagine hunters and giants, chase and danger, extinction and blame. Those may be parts of the wider discussion, but they are not the whole of life. Most coexistence is ordinary. It is the overlapping use of water, food, landscapes, shelter, paths, and seasonal routes. When giant sloths still walked, early humans were not standing outside nature as observers. They were animals too, vulnerable, hungry, skilled, curious, cautious, and dependent on the same earth. They read the land through footprints, dung, broken branches, bird behavior, smell, weather, and memory. A giant sloth's presence may have been one of the signs within that larger reading. If its tracks appeared near a muddy lake edge, they might tell people that a large animal had passed recently. If bones appeared in a shelter or on open ground, they might become material, warning, food opportunity, or memory. If a living animal was seen, the response could depend on distance, need, group size, tools, season, and risk. We should not make ancient people either helpless or reckless. They were capable observers of their environments, but they were also facing animals whose size and strength deserved caution. The earth they shared with giant sloths was not a hunting ground in the narrow sense. It was a living home, where every decision had cost. A person following a track might be seeking information, not only prey. A group approaching a carcass might be scavenging, not killing. A bone modified by human hands might speak of use after death, not necessarily a hunt that caused death. The evidence from Santa Elena, for example, is important because it suggests human modification of giant ground sloth osteoderms before fossilization. But even that does not tell us exactly how the animal died. It tells us that human hands and sloth remains entered the same chain of events. That is already meaningful. It brings humans into the giant sloth's world without forcing a single story onto every trace. At White Sands, the footprints are equally powerful because they preserve movement. The human prints inside or near sloth tracks suggest close attention to the animal's path. Some researchers interpret them as possible stalking or interaction. But again, the mud does not give us a voice recording of intention. It does not say fear, hunger, play, teaching, testing, or curiosity. It gives us pattern, and we interpret the pattern with care. This humility makes the story stronger, not weaker. For a sleep audio video built on truth, uncertainty is not a flaw. It is part of honesty. The old Earth was not less real because we cannot know every detail. It may feel more real because it resists being flattened into one simple answer. Imagine a small human group near an ancient lake. The ground is damp, the air is cool, there are tracks from birds, large mammals, and perhaps a ground sloth that passed not long before. Someone notices the shape of the print, the drag or pressure of claws, the depth that tells weight. The group slows. They do not need to speak loudly. The land is already speaking through signs. Somewhere beyond sight, the animal may still be moving, or it may be long gone. In that moment, humans are not rulers of the scene. They are readers of it. And the giant sloth, present or absent, has already changed their attention. That is one of the most human parts of this ancient world, not conquest, but noticing. The first relationship may have been made not by attack, but by looking down at the ground and understanding that another large life had passed there before. The human presence in the world of giant sloths should be felt as a widening of the story, not as an instant ending. It is easy to look backward and place humans at the center of everything, because humans are the ones asking the question now. But when giant ground sloths still walked, people were only one part of a much older living system. They arrived into landscapes already shaped by climate, plants, rivers, predators, seasons, and the movements of animals that had no need to know human names. A giant sloth did not become meaningful only when a person saw it. It had already been meaningful to the plants it browsed, to the soil it pressed, to the caves it entered, to the predators that judged its strength, and to the small organisms that would one day use what its body returned. Human beings added a new kind of attention to that world. They could remember tracks, teach younger people what signs meant, choose tools, carry stories, and turn bone, stone, wood, hide, or plant fiber into useful things. But they were still living inside the same limits as every other creature. Hunger, weather, danger, fatigue, distance, and uncertainty. This makes the meeting between humans and giant sloths more interesting than a simple battle. It was a meeting between two ways of being slow. The sloth was slow through body and weight. Humans were slow through learning. A person could not understand a landscape in one day. Knowledge had to gather across walks, mistakes, seasons, and repeated noticing. A track near water might become a lesson. A large animal seen from far away might become a memory. A carcass might become food, material, or warning. A living sloth might be avoided, watched, followed, or approached depending on need and risk. The same kind of evidence could mean different things in different moments. That is why the old earth must stay open in our imagination. At White Sands, the preserved tracks suggest humans and giant sloths crossed the same wet ground in ways that may show close interaction. At Santa Helena, modified sloth bones suggest human hands worked with remains of these animals in central Brazil. Together, these traces show that humans and giant sloths were not sealed away from one another, but they do not give permission to turn every encounter into the same story. A footprint is not a full biography. A modified bone is not a full hunt. A fossil site is not an entire continent. The truth is broader and quieter. For a time, human life and giant sloth life overlapped within the same ancient earth. That overlap may have lasted differently in different regions. It may have included curiosity, caution, opportunity, fear, skill, and practical use. It may also have included long periods where humans and sloths lived near the same resources without meeting directly at all. Coexistence is often made of nearness, without drama. Two species can share a valley through different hours of the day. They can use the same water in different seasons. They can leave signs for one another without touching. They can affect each other's choices, simply by being present in the landscape. Imagine a night near an ancient lake. Human figures rest near a small shelter, listening to wind over low ground. Far away, beyond sight, a giant sloth moves through brush, feeding slowly. Neither side controls the whole scene. The lake, the plants, the cold air, the soil, and the darkness hold them both. By morning, there may be tracks. Some will be fresh. Some will be blurred. Some will be crossed by birds or smaller mammals. A person may notice them and understand that a large body passed close in the night. The sloth may never know that its movement changed human attention. Yet that is still a relationship. The earth of giant sloths was full of such partial meetings. It was not waiting for a final explanation. It was living forward, one step, one season, one trace at a time. When humans shared that earth, they did not immediately solve it or own it. They entered its uncertainty. They learned from signs left by bodies larger than themselves. And somewhere in that shared uncertainty, the giant sloth remained what it had always been first. Not a symbol of extinction, not a trophy, not a warning, but a living animal moving through a world wide enough to hold both its weight and the first human questions around it. The end of the Ice Age did not arrive like a door closing in one night. It came as a long change in the conditions around life. Ice retreated in some regions, temperatures shifted, rainfall patterns changed. Some places became warmer, drier, wetter, more wooded, more open, or more unstable than they had been before. For a human mind, these changes can sound like words on a page: warming, drying, vegetation shift, habitat loss. For a giant ground sloth, they would have been felt in the body. A familiar patch of plants might not return in the same way. A water source might become less reliable. A valley that once held enough browse might become harder to use. A path between feeding areas might grow longer. The animal would not know that an epoch was ending. It would only know, if it could know anything in its own animal way, that the land was asking more from each step. This is the first thing to understand about the changing earth around giant sloths. Extinction is often prepared by ordinary difficulty. Not always by one disaster. Not always by one sudden event. Sometimes a world becomes harder slowly. A large animal can endure a hard year. It can endure a shift in season. A population can survive loss, movement, and stress for a time. But if changes gather across generations, the shape of survival begins to narrow. A giant ground sloth needed plants, space, shelter, and enough successful young to replace the old. If the landscape changed faster than the animal's way of life could follow, then size could become a burden as well as a strength. The same body that once allowed it to reach high vegetation and defend itself also required a steady supply of food. The same slowness that once fit the land might become costly if food patches spread farther apart. The same reliance on certain habitats might become dangerous if those habitats shrank, shifted, or fragmented. This does not mean climate alone explains everything. The disappearance of giant ground sloths and other late Pleistocene megafauna remains a complex subject, and many scientists discuss climate change and human pressure together rather than as one simple cause. But before we speak of endings, we have to feel the environmental pressure that came with the end of the last glacial world. The earth that had made room for giant sloths was changing its arrangement. In some parts of the Americas, the old plant communities did not simply move like a single carpet across the land. They broke, mixed, retreated, expanded, and reorganized. Animals that depended on broad patterns of vegetation would have had to respond. Some could move, some could adjust. Some populations may have lasted longer in refuges where conditions remained suitable. Others may have declined when the old balance no longer held. This is why the story cannot be told as though every giant sloth vanished at the same moment for the same reason. Different species, regions, and populations likely experience change differently. The Shasta ground sloth of North America, smaller than the greatest South American forms, belonged to particular dry landscapes and left traces in places like caves. Larger ground sloths in South America had different histories. The end of the Ice Age touched all of them through climate and ecology, but not always in identical ways. Imagine the same valley from earlier in the story, but after many generations of change, the river no longer floods the same edges. Certain shrubs are less common. Trees gather in new places, or open ground spreads where cover once stood. The air feels different across the year. Other animals have shifted their routes. Predators follow different prey. Humans, in some places, are present too, reading the same changing landscape for their own survival. A giant sloth moving through this world may still find food. It may still rest, feed, and leave tracks. Life does not announce decline every morning. For a long time, ordinary life can continue inside a narrowing future. That is what makes the end of the Ice Age so quietly powerful in this story. The world did not need to hate the giant sloth. It only needed to stop fitting it well enough. And once the fit began to loosen, every other pressure could matter more. Climate change becomes most real when it reaches food. For a giant ground sloth, the end of the Ice Age was not an abstract warming of the planet. It was a change in leaves, stems, shrubs, grasses, water, shade, and the timing of growth. A plant that once returned after a season might become less common. A feeding ground that once offered enough browse might grow thinner. A wet place might dry earlier. A cool refuge might shrink. A route that once connected one useful patch to another might become more exposed or more difficult. These are small changes when seen one by one, but a large animal lives by the sum of them. Its body cannot be fed by averages. It needs real plants in real places at real times. When giant sloths still walked, their survival depended on the land, remaining generous enough, not everywhere, but often enough. As the late glacial world gave way to a warmer interglacial world, many ecosystems reorganized. Some landscapes became more wooded, others became drier, some plant communities shifted their ranges. The result was not one simple transformation, but many local changes layered across time. For a giant ground sloth population, that could mean some old places still worked, while others became less reliable. This unevenness matters. It helps us avoid the false picture of one final day when the Ice Age ended and all the giant animals disappeared. Life rarely ends so neatly. More often, populations thin, retreat, survive in pockets, fail to recover after hard years, or become more vulnerable to pressures that once could be absorbed. A giant sloth could live through a bad season. A population might live through many, but if young animals survived less often, if adults had to travel farther, if food quality declined, or if suitable habitat became broken into smaller usable areas, then decline could begin quietly. The animal would still look powerful, its claws would still be long, its body would still be heavy, but the world beneath that power would be changing. This is one of the cold truths of extinction. A species can remain impressive even while its future is becoming fragile. The same body that once fitted a landscape can become harder to support when the landscape changes. Anymore, in this way, the giant sloth's size was both a gift and a demand. Large herbivores can influence vegetation, but they also depend deeply on it. They need enough plant material to make reproduction, growth, healing, and movement possible. If the vegetation changes too much, the animal cannot simply decide to become something else. Evolution can shape bodies over long time, but climate and habitat can shift faster than a large mammal population can adapt. This does not mean every ground sloth faced the same problem in the same way. The Americas held many climates and many kinds of ground sloths. Some lived in dry regions, some in different plant communities, and some may have lasted longer than others depending on local conditions. But the larger pattern is clear enough to guide the story. The end of the Pleistocene brought major environmental change, and many large mammals disappeared around this broader transition. Scientists continue to discuss how climate, human activity, and ecological vulnerability interacted, but few serious explanations treat the old world as unchanged. The Earth itself was moving into a new arrangement. Imagine a ground sloth returning to a place its kind had used for generations. The slope is the same shape, the stones are still there, the bend in the watercourse still catches the evening light, but the plants are different. Not completely gone, not dramatically ruined, just less familiar in their timing and abundance. The animal feeds, but perhaps longer. It rests, but perhaps after walking farther. It finds shelter, but perhaps with less cover between feeding places. Nothing in the scene announces disaster. The sky does not darken, the ground does not open. Yet the old relationship between body and place has become slightly less dependable. That is how a changing Earth can become dangerous to a slow giant, not by refusing life all at once, but by making each ordinary need a little harder to meet. The end of the Ice Age was also the end of a certain kind of room, not empty space, but ecological room, the room for large bodies to keep moving through broad plant communities, to find enough food across seasons, to recover after hard years, and to remain part of the land without being pushed too close to the edge. Giant ground sloths had lived through changing climates before, because their deeper lineage was not young. Ground sloths had existed for millions of years in the Americas. But every period of change has its own combination of pressures. The late Pleistocene ending was not only a matter of temperature, it was a time when climate, vegetation, animal communities, and human presence overlapped in ways that may have made recovery harder for some large mammals. This is why the story must be told with care. If we say only the climate changed, we make the Earth sound like a single machine. If we say only humans arrived, we make people sound like the only force in a world that was already shifting. The truth, as far as evidence allows, is more tangled and more interesting. The Earth around giant sloths was reorganizing, and living things had to respond at the pace their bodies allowed. For a small, fast-breeding animal, disturbance can sometimes be survived through numbers and flexibility. For a large mammal, the margin may be narrower. Large bodies often grow more slowly, need more food, and may not replace losses quickly. We should not assign the exact same life history to every extinct ground sloth, but the general pressure on large mammals is clear. When the environment becomes less predictable, recovery from loss can become harder. A few fewer young surviving each generation may not look dramatic at first. A few more adults dying from hunger, injury, hunting, drought, or stress may not seem like the end. Yet over time, such differences can bend a population downward. The land may still look alive, the plants may still grow, the rivers may still move, the birds may still call, even some giant sloths may still walk through the old places, but the pattern beneath them may already be thinning. This is one of the most haunting parts of ecological change. Disappearance begins before absence is visible. An animal can still be present while its future is quietly shrinking. Imagine the Earth during this transition not as a battlefield, but as a great set of relationships losing alignment. A plant community shifts north, upslope, or into a new mixture. A water source becomes seasonal. A predator follows changing prey. Humans use a landscape with growing knowledge and skill. Fire, whether natural or human-influenced in some regions, may change vegetation patterns. A large herbivore tries to keep living by the old habits, adjusting where it can. Some individuals succeed. Some populations may persist longer than others, but across enough time, if the conditions that once supported them become too scattered, the old rhythm fails. This does not make the giant sloth weak. It makes it dependent, as all life is dependent. Its strength had meaning only inside a world that could receive that strength. Its claws mattered only where there was food to pull, ground to brace against, and enough safety to use them. Its size mattered only where the land could feed size. When that land changed, the animal's great body became part of the problem it had to solve. The end of the Ice Age, therefore, surrounds the giant sloth story like a slow tide. It does not answer every question, but it changes the shape of every answer. It tells us that the Earth they walked through was not frozen in time. It was moving toward the warmer world we know, but not gently for every species. Some animals adjusted, some retreated. Some vanished from mainland ecosystems. By the time the Pleistocene gave way to the Holocene, many of the great mammals of the Americas were gone or nearly gone. The giant sloths were among those losses. Their disappearance was not the disappearance of one strange animal from a stable stage. It was part of a much larger reorganization of life. And still, while it was happening, the days themselves may have remained quiet. A sloth feeding at dusk would not know that the world was becoming less itself. It would only know the next plant, the next step, the next cold night, the next stretch of ground between hunger and rest. The disappearance of giant ground sloths is difficult to tell honestly, because the simple answers are the most tempting. It is easy to say the climate changed and leave the story there. It is easy to say humans arrived and make that the whole explanation. It is easy to imagine one final cause moving across the Americas like a shadow. But extinct animals do not usually leave behind such clean endings. They leave bones, tracks, dates, layers of soil, broken traces, possible tools, preserved dung, climate records, and unanswered spaces between all of them. The giant ground sloth's disappearance belongs to this harder kind of truth. It was probably not one pressure acting alone in exactly the same way everywhere. It was a series of pressures meeting different species, different landscapes, and different populations at different moments. Some ground sloths were smaller and lived in particular dry environments. Some were enormous and belonged to South American worlds with their own histories. Some may have lasted longer in certain regions than others. Some traces suggest coexistence with humans. Some evidence points toward environmental change. None of this allows a careless sentence. When giant sloths still walked, Earth was already changing, and humans were becoming part of many American landscapes. That overlap matters, but it does not automatically tell us the exact weight of each cause. Climate could reduce or rearrange food. Humans could add hunting pressure, scavenging pressure, fire use, disturbance, or competition for places and resources. Large predators, disease, drought, slow reproduction, fragmented habitat, and chance could also matter in local ways. The hard part is that these forces do not have to work separately. A population already stressed by vegetation change might be more vulnerable to even low levels of hunting. A group of animals reduced by drought might fail to recover if young were lost more often. A species with a large body and slower replacement rate might survive ordinary danger for thousands of years, then decline when several ordinary dangers begin to happen together. This is why Troop 8 must be slow. The question is not only, what killed them? The better question is, what changed around them until their old way of surviving no longer held? A giant sloth did not need every forest to vanish, every plant to die, or every human group to hunt it constantly. It only needed the balance of survival to tilt. If food became less reliable, movement more costly, shelter more scattered, and human encounters more frequent in certain places, the future could narrow without any single dramatic moment. This is one of the coldest truths in natural history. Extinction can be made from small margins. A few fewer births, a few more deaths, a few harder seasons, a few lost refuges, a few encounters at the wrong time. From inside the life of one animal, nothing might look final. It feeds, it rests, it follows scent toward water. It pulls leaves with its claws, it crosses ground where its ancestors crossed before. But at the level of the population, the old pattern may already be weakening. Scientists continue to study these endings because the evidence is uneven. Fossils preserve some places better than others. Dry caves can hold dung that open landscapes destroy. Mud can preserve footprints only under rare conditions. Human-modified bones can show contact with remains, but not always the full story of death. Dates can place events near one another, but nearness is not always cause. This is not a weakness in science. It is the discipline of not pretending the past is simpler than it was. For a sleep story, that honesty matters. We do not need to frighten the listener with a single villain. We can let the real uncertainty remain calm. The giant sloths vanished from the mainland, not because they were unreal, not because they were poorly made, and not because the earth suddenly rejected them in one clean act. They vanished from a world whose relationships were changing. Plants, climate, water, human presence, animal communities, and the fragile mathematics of survival. The more carefully we look, the less their ending feels like a single fall. It feels more like a slow loosening of the ties that once held their great bodies to the land. To understand why the disappearance is not simple, we have to imagine pressures combining in ordinary ways. A dry season does not know that humans are also nearby. A human hunter does not need to know that a population has already been weakened by several hard years. A plant community does not announce that it is becoming less useful to a large herbivore. Each pressure acts through its own path, but inside a living population, they meet. This is what makes the end of giant ground sloths so difficult and so meaningful. Climate change could alter food and water. Human presence could change the risk of certain places. A predator could take a young or weakened animal. A drought could make recovery harder. A population split into smaller groups could lose resilience. None of these factors needs to be overwhelming alone. Together, they can become more than their parts. For a giant ground sloth, the margin between survival and decline may have been made of repeated small costs. A longer walk to food means more energy spent. Less nutritious plants mean more feeding for the same strength. More exposure between shelter and browse means more danger. Fewer young reaching adulthood means the population ages. A small number of human kills, if they happened in certain vulnerable populations, could matter more than we might expect, especially for large animals that may not replace losses quickly. This is not a claim that humans alone erased every giant sloth everywhere. It is a way of seeing how even limited pressure can become important when a species is already stressed. The reverse is also true. Climate stress alone might not always be enough if a population is large, connected, and able to move. But if habitats are shifting, Routes are blocked by distance or unsuitable land, and human groups are using the same water, caves, or hunting grounds. Recovery may become harder. The old Earth was not a list of separate causes. It was a web of timing. The same event can matter differently depending on when it happens. A drought during a healthy period may be endured. A drought after years of decline may become severe. Hunting pressure on a widespread population may be absorbed. Hunting pressure on a small, isolated group may not. A change in vegetation may be manageable if other feeding grounds remain connected. It may become dangerous if those grounds are far apart. This is why extinction studies often feel uncertain to listeners. People want the one reason. The evidence often points toward interaction. For giant sloths, the interaction may have varied by region. In North America, some trackways suggest humans were at least closely aware of ground sloths in the same landscapes. In South America, modified sloth bones suggest people, and sloth remains were part of the same human world in some places. Across the broader Americas, many large mammals disappeared near the transition out of the Pleistocene, a time of major environmental change and expanding human presence. The overlap is striking, but overlap is not a complete explanation. It is a question that must be handled with care. Imagine a small ground sloth population living in a changing valley. For generations, the valley has offered enough food, shelter, and movement. Then the plants shift. Water becomes less predictable. The animals spread farther to feed. Young are more exposed. A few adults die in poor seasons. Humans begin to use the same valley at certain times of year, perhaps watching tracks, perhaps scavenging, perhaps hunting when opportunity appears. No single day looks like extinction, but the population is no longer held by the land in the same way. Its safety net is thinner. The next hard season matters more. The next lost adult matters more. The next failed birth matters more. This is how a great animal can disappear without a single dramatic ending. The final individual may die in an ordinary place, under an ordinary sky, with no witness and no sign that a whole ancient pattern is ending. The earth continues. Plants grow. Smaller animals move through the same valley. Humans remember or forget what they saw, but one kind of weight is gone from the ground. This is why the disappearance of giant sloths should make us careful rather than certain. Their ending was not a riddle solved by one word. It was likely a slow convergence of changing climate, shifting habitats, human contact, ecological vulnerability, and time. The last giant ground sloths did not know they were last. That may be the most sobering thought in the whole story. Extinction is a word invented by those who come after. To the animal, there is only weather, hunger, scent, movement, pain, rest, and the next patch of plants. A final population does not carry a sign over itself. It lives as long as it can, inside the same ordinary needs that shaped all the generations before it. This is why the disappearance of giant sloths should not be imagined as one grand farewell. More likely, in many places, it was a thinning. Fewer tracks near old water, fewer bodies moving through brush, fewer dung deposits in shelters, fewer young surviving into adulthood, fewer encounters with humans, fewer signs for predators and scavengers to read. The world would not become silent all at once. It would become less heavy. This quietness is hard for the human mind, because we often notice loss only after the pattern is already broken. A valley can still look alive after a large animal is gone. Plants still grow, birds still move, rivers still reflect the sky. Smaller mammals still leave prints in mud, but the missing pressure changes the system in ways that may take time to understand. When giant ground sloths vanished, the earth did not lose only a shape. It lost a browser, a mover of nutrients, a maker of paths, a source of food after death, a carrier of ecological relationships, and a presence that other species had lived around. Their disappearance was therefore not only an ending for them, it was a change in the living grammar of the landscape. The debate over why they disappeared continues because every explanation has to fit many kinds of evidence. Climate records show major environmental change near the end of the Pleistocene. Fossils show the loss of many large mammals. Archaeological traces show that humans and some giant sloths overlapped in time and space. Sites such as White Sands and Santa Elena show forms of contact or association that cannot be ignored. But the evidence also resists a single, simple formula. Different regions had different climates. Different species had different bodies and habits. Human populations were not the same everywhere. Preservation is uneven. Absence of evidence in one place is not always evidence of absence. A responsible story has to carry all of that without becoming vague. So we can say this. Giant ground sloths disappeared from mainland ecosystems during the broad late Pleistocene and early Holocene transition, when climate change and human presence were both part of the world they lived in. Many researchers consider multiple interacting pressures more plausible than a single cause applied everywhere. That is enough to make the story truthful, without pretending we know more than the evidence allows. Imagine the final years of one small population. There is no music beneath them, no prophecy, no sense of history looking on. There are only animals trying to live. One old sloth feeds more slowly than before. A younger one ranges farther than its ancestors did. A season of poor plants leaves bodies thinner. Human tracks appear sometimes near water. A predator follows weakness. A drought makes the familiar route less useful. A birth fails. Another young animal does not survive. None of these moments alone is the whole explanation. Together, they become a narrowing corridor. Eventually, there are no more steps. The ground dries without receiving that weight. Plants grow without meeting that mouth. Caves sit empty of that presence. Humans, if they remember less with each generation. The Earth continues forward, but one of its ancient ways of being large has closed. This is not a story that needs exaggeration. The truth is already deep enough. A creature can be powerful for millions of years and still be vulnerable when the world changes around it. A landscape can look whole and still be missing a relationship. A disappearance can be slow enough that no one sees it clearly while it is happening. The giant sloth's ending teaches us to be cautious with simple answers. It asks us to respect evidence, uncertainty, and the quiet ways life depends on conditions that can change. And it leaves us with a darker, gentler thought. Perhaps the most important losses on Earth are not always the loudest ones, but the ones that make the world slightly less itself. When giant ground sloths vanished, Earth did not become empty. That is part of what makes the loss so difficult to notice. The rivers still moved, rain still softened the ground, plants still grew from seed, root, and season. Other animals still fed, nested, hunted, rested, and died. To a human walking through those later landscapes, the world might have looked complete, but completeness can be deceptive. A landscape can continue after losing one of its old relationships. It can remain green, noisy, and alive, while still carrying an absence too deep for the eye to measure. The disappearance of giant sloths was not only the removal of large bodies from the Americas, it was the removal of a way the land had been touched. The plants no longer met their mouths. Branches no longer bent under their pulling strength. Soil no longer received the same heavy steps. Dry shelters no longer gathered the same dung in the same rhythm. Predators and scavengers no longer encountered those bodies as living risk or dead resource. The world went on, but it went on differently. This is the heart of Truk 9. What was lost was not just an animal. What was lost was a pattern. For thousands of years, in the places where they lived, giant ground sloths had been part of how space, food, movement, and decay were arranged. A large herbivore does not need intention to become important. It shapes the world by needing to eat. It shapes the world by moving weight across ground. It shapes the world by carrying plant matter through its body and returning part of it to the soil. It shapes the world by becoming, after death, a temporary center for many smaller lives. When such an animal disappears, the plants do not receive the same pressure. The soil does not receive the same disturbance. The small organisms do not receive the same material. Other animals lose one more presence in the web of signs around them. This does not mean every effect can be measured easily today. The past is too old, and the evidence is too incomplete. But the principle is clear enough. Ecosystems are not only lists of species, they are relationships among bodies, places, and repeated actions. Remove one large body from that relationship, and the shape of the whole system can shift, even if the change is slow and uneven. Imagine a valley after the sloths are gone. At first, almost nothing seems different. Morning light still reaches the same slope, birds still move through low branches, insects still rise from the grass. A small mammal crosses a patch of dust, but the old track no longer deepens under the pressure of a huge foot. A shrub grows past the height at which it might once have been broken. A cave floor dries without fresh dung from that animal. A predator no longer pauses at the scent of a difficult, powerful herbivore nearby. A child born generations later never learns to recognize the print of that creature, because no fresh print exists to teach from. Loss becomes cultural as well as ecological. First the animal disappears, then the signs disappear, then the memory thins. Eventually only bones and rare traces remain to tell people that the world once held another scale of life. This is why giant sloths matter to the title question. To ask what Earth was like when they still walked is also to ask what Earth became after they stopped. Before, the land held enormous slow movement as part of its ordinary life. Afterward, that movement was gone. The land did not collapse, but it became less like its former self. A missing giant does not leave a hole shaped only like its body. It leaves a hole shaped like everything that body used to do. The absence of giant ground sloths also changed how the past could be remembered. While they were alive, their presence could be read directly from the land. A fresh track near water, a broken branch, a large body seen at a distance, dung in a dry shelter, bones after death, a route through brush that seemed easier because something heavy had passed that way before. These signs did not need science to be meaningful. Other animals could respond to them through scent and habit. Early humans could notice them through attention and memory. But once the animals were gone, the land slowly stopped producing new signs. The last fresh track dried and was erased. The last dung deposit aged. The last bone weathered was buried, broken, moved, or lost. After enough generations, people could no longer learn the animal from life. They could only inherit memory, if memory remained at all, or encounter old remains without the living body that explained them. This is a quiet part of extinction that is easy to miss. Extinction removes the teacher as well as the creature. A living animal teaches a landscape how to respond to it. It teaches predators caution or opportunity. It teaches plants recovery. It teaches humans recognition, avoidance, use, or respect. It teaches younger members of its own kind where to move and how to survive, if such learning exists in that species. When the animal is gone, the teaching ends. The ecosystem may adapt to its absence, but it cannot keep learning from its presence. The giant sloth became, over time, a fossil question instead of a living fact. Museums, excavations, cave deposits, and trackways now carry pieces of the memory that the living Earth no longer holds in motion. This shift matters because it helps us understand what was lost beyond biology. The giant sloth's body once connected deep evolutionary time with ordinary days. Millions of years of sloth history reached into one animal feeding at dusk. That animal's step connected ancient lineage to mud. Its dung connected ancient lineage to soil. Its death connected ancient lineage to scavengers, microbes, and mineral return. When the lineage ended in those mainland landscapes, the connection was broken. Earth still had sloths, in the form of smaller tree-dwelling relatives, but it no longer had those great ground-walking forms in the same living way. The difference is not just size, it is role. A tree sloth and a giant ground sloth do not ask the same things from the world. They do not place the same pressure on plants. They do not move through the same spaces. They do not return the same kind of weight to the soil. To lose the giant ground sloths was to lose a whole expression of what sloth life had once become. In the old Earth, slowness had taken many forms. Some slowness hung in trees. Some slowness crossed valleys with claws and heavy limbs. Some slowness shaped caves, shrubs, and open ground. After the giant forms vanished, slowness remained, but not in that enormous ground-bound way. Imagine the landscape not as a painting, but as a song with certain low notes removed. The melody continues. There is still wind, water, insect sound, bird movement, hoofbeats of other animals where they remain, human footsteps, plant growth, and seasonal change. But the deep note of the giant sloth is gone. The listener who never heard it may not know what is missing. That is how ecological absence often works. A generation born after loss inherits a quieter world and mistakes it for the full range of sound. Later, science helps restore part of the missing memory, not by bringing the animal back, but by showing that the present is not the only way Earth has ever been. Fossils and footprints remind us that what feels normal now is only one moment in a much longer story. When giant sloths still walked, the world held a form of life that made slowness visible at a monumental scale. When they disappeared, Earth lost that living lesson, and the loss became deeper because, after a while, no one could simply look across a valley and learn from the animal itself. What was lost when giant sloths vanished was also a certain feeling of scale. Modern people can read that some ancient sloths were enormous, compare measurements, look at skeletons, and understand the fact in the mind. But a living giant is different from a measured giant. To see a large ground sloth moving through a valley would have changed the meaning of the valley itself. A tree would not be only a tree, it would be something a massive animal might reach toward, pull from, or rest beside. A muddy bank would not be only soft ground. It would be a surface capable of receiving a print deeper than a person's. A cave would not be only shelter for small animals or humans. It might also be part of the life of a huge herbivore whose dung, hair, scent, and presence entered the darkness over time. When the giant sloths disappeared, the physical scale of those relationships disappeared with them. The landscape became smaller in one important sense, not because its mountains shrank or its rivers narrowed, but because one of the large ways of using it was gone. This is difficult to feel today because most of us inherit an already reduced world. We know many animals through images, museums, videos, and names, rather than through shared ground. The old Americas, before the final losses of many megafauna, carried a wider range of large mammals than the living Americas do now. Giant ground sloths were one part of that wider range. Their absence is therefore connected to a larger silence, the loss of many big herbivores and predators that once made the continents feel physically different. A person walking through those ancient landscapes would have needed to think about size differently. Distance mattered because large animals crossed it. Water mattered because many bodies gathered there. Mud mattered because it recorded not only small prints, but the deep pressure of weight. Plants mattered because they were food for animals powerful enough to change their shape. The disappearance of giant sloths removed one of the clearest examples of that older scale. But the loss was not only visual, it was behavioral. The world no longer had that particular slow browser moving plant matter through its body. It no longer had that particular risk and resource for humans, predators, scavengers, insects, and microbes. It no longer had young sloths learning, if they did learn from their surroundings or others, where to feed and where to rest. It no longer had mothers and offspring, old individuals and strong adults, sick animals and surviving animals, all participating in the uncertainty of ordinary life. Extinction turns a living variation into a fixed category. The animal becomes giant ground sloth, a name, a skeleton, a reconstruction, an exhibit. But while alive, there was no single perfect sloth. There were individuals, some larger, some smaller, some cautious, some bold, some healthy, some tired, some born into easier seasons, some into harder ones. The loss of the species includes the loss of all those possible lives. This is where the story becomes deeply educational, without needing to become dramatic. It teaches that biodiversity is not only a count of species, it is the range of ways life can meet Earth. Giant sloths represented one way, large, slow, ground-dwelling, plant-focused, strongly tied to space and vegetation. When that way disappeared, Earth did not stop being Earth, but it became poorer in possibilities. The present world is still beautiful, still alive, still worthy of care. Yet it is not the complete measure of what life can be. Fossils widen our imagination by showing that normal has changed many times. They remind us that today's quiet valley may once have held a weight we would hardly believe if the bones had not remained. They remind us that absence can become invisible when no one remembers the fullness that came before. By the end of this 9th part of the journey, the giant sloth is no longer only a creature from the past. It is a measure of what landscapes can lose while still appearing whole. It asks us to look at the living world with more attention. What pressures are present now? What relationships are thinning now? What forms of life are becoming rare so gradually that the ground still looks complete beneath them? The story of giant ground sloths now turns back toward us, but it should do so gently. If we have followed their world carefully, we have not been looking only at an extinct animal. We have been looking at a way Earth once held life. A large, slow mammal could walk through the Americas and belong there. Plants, soil, weather, caves, water, predators, scavengers, and early humans all formed parts of the same larger setting. None of those parts can explain the whole story alone. The giant sloth teaches this by its very body. It was powerful, but dependent. Strange to us, but natural in its own time. Large enough to change the land, yet vulnerable to changes in the land. This is one of the lessons the past gives, without raising its voice. No creature, however strong, lives by itself. A body is always supported by invisible agreements: enough food, enough water, enough space, enough safety, enough successful generations, enough stability for habits to keep working. When those agreements change, even a great animal can become fragile. This does not make the giant sloth a failure. It makes it a truthful example of life on Earth. Every living thing depends on conditions it did not create. Humans do too. We often imagine ourselves outside this rule because we build houses, roads, farms, tools, and screens. But the deeper truth is older than any invention. We still depend on soil, water, climate, plants, pollinators, forests, oceans, and the quiet labor of organisms too small to see. The giant sloth's disappearance reminds us that the ground beneath a species can change before the species understands what is happening. It reminds us that the world can look normal while relationships are thinning. It reminds us that absence often becomes clear only later, when fresh signs no longer appear. In that sense, the old Earth is not only behind us, it is a mirror held at a long distance. We look at a fossil and see a creature gone, but if we look longer, we also see a question about the living world now. Which animals today are becoming harder to find? Which habitats are becoming smaller, warmer, drier, more divided, or less predictable? Which relationships are weakening quietly before the loss becomes obvious? The answer does not need to be spoken with fear. Fear can wake the mind too sharply. A better response is attention, calm attention, the kind of attention that sees a landscape not as empty space, but as a set of living relationships. The kind of attention that understands that a footprint is connected to a body to food, food to climate, climate to water, and water to choices made by many living beings. When giant sloths still walked, Earth was not perfect, but it was rich in forms of life that are no longer here. Their loss does not mean the present is worthless. It means the present is precious because it too can change. The living world around us is not guaranteed just because it is familiar. Familiar things can disappear slowly. Rivers can grow quieter. Insects can become fewer. Forest edges can shift. Large animals can retreat into smaller spaces. People can forget what abundance used to feel like. The giant sloth, with its heavy steps and slow strength, asks us to remember that normal is not permanent. What feels ordinary in one age may become unimaginable in another, and what seems unimaginable now may once have been as ordinary as a large animal feeding beside a river at dusk. The educational value of the giant sloth story is not only that extinction happened, Extinction has happened many times in Earth's history, and if we say only that, the lesson stays too distant. The deeper value is that extinction is not separate from ordinary life. It grows from the same relationships that allow life to continue. Food, water, climate, shelter, reproduction, movement, and safety are not dramatic things most days. They are the quiet structure beneath every living body. When that structure holds, even a strange and enormous animal can seem natural. When it weakens, even a strong animal can become vulnerable. This is why giant ground sloths are such useful teachers. They were not small, fragile creatures at the edge of notice. They were large mammals, some among the most impressive plant-eaters of their worlds. Yet their size did not place them outside dependence. Their power did not free them from plants. Their claws did not free them from water. Their weight did not free them from time. They remind us that strength in nature is always conditional. It works only inside the world that supports it. Humans need this lesson because modern life often trains us to see nature as scenery or resource, not relationship. A forest becomes timber, a river becomes water supply, a field becomes production, an animal becomes image, data, or problem. But the older Earth of giant sloths shows something quieter and more complete. A forest edge was food, shelter, shade, scent, danger, and recovery. A riverbank was water, mud, tracks, plants, meeting place, and memory. A cave was shelter, preservation, darkness, mineral, and trace. The sloth's body did not separate these meanings. It lived through them all at once. That is how life still works, even when human systems divide the world into categories. The present world is not less connected because we name its pieces separately. It is just easier for us to forget the connections. The giant sloth helps us remember by being too large to ignore. If such a body depended on hidden relationships, then surely smaller lives do too. A bee, a seed, a fungus, a bird, a fish, a tree, and a human child all depend on conditions that can be damaged before the damage becomes visible. This does not mean the lesson should become hopeless. In fact, attention can be a form of care. To know that relationships matter is to know where care can begin. Protecting habitat is not only saving scenery, it is protecting movement, feeding, nesting, shelter, soil, water, and future generations. Respecting evidence is not only a scientific habit, it is a way of staying honest with the world, especially when the past is incomplete and the present is changing. The story of giant sloths also teaches humility in how we speak. We should not claim more than fossils, tracks, and research allow. We should not turn uncertainty into fantasy, but we should not treat uncertainty as emptiness either. A partial trace can still teach. A footprint does not tell us everything about the animal, but it tells us something real. A preserved dung deposit does not restore a whole ecosystem, but it opens one small window into diet and place. A modified bone does not explain all human relationships with giant sloths, but it shows that contact occurred in some form. Truth grows from holding these pieces carefully. That may be the most useful habit this video can leave with the listener. Not certainty, not fear, but careful attention. Giant sloths walk through an Earth where their size made sense. Then the conditions changed, and that form of life disappeared. Today, other forms of life are still walking, flying, rooting, swimming, and growing through conditions that we influence more than any ancient human group could have imagined. The lesson is not that everything is doomed. The lesson is that living relationships can be protected only when they are noticed before they are gone. The old giant sloth cannot return to its valley, but the attention it asks from us can still be alive. In the end, the giant ground sloth leaves us with a quiet kind of knowledge, not the kind that solves every mystery, and not the kind that turns the past into a simple warning. It leaves us with a way of seeing. The Earth that held giant sloths was not magical. It was not kinder than ours, and it was not cruel in some special ancient way. It was a real Earth of plants, mud, hunger, weather, birth, danger, shelter, and death. It was a world where a slow animal could become enormous because, for a long time, the land made room for that form of life. Then the room changed. Climate shifted. Plant communities reorganized. Human presence became part of some landscapes. Pressures overlapped. Populations thinned. The living animal became a trace, then a fossil, then a question. But the value of its story is not only in the sadness of its ending. The value is in what it reveals about belonging. A species belongs to Earth through more than survival. It belongs through what it touches, what it eats, what it carries, what it disturbs, what it returns, and what other lives learn around it. The giant ground sloth belonged through weight, through slow steps near water, through plants pulled down by strong limbs, through dung left in dry shelters, through tracks pressed into mud, through bones that fed smaller lives after death. Through the attention of early humans who may have watched, followed, used, avoided, or remembered it. When that animal vanished, Earth did not stop, but one way of belonging ended. This is the lesson that can stay with the listener after the story grows quiet. The living world is made of relationships that are easy to overlook while they are still working. We often notice a creature most clearly when it has become rare, and understand a relationship most deeply after it has been broken. The giant sloth asks us to reverse that habit, to notice before absence, to care before memory becomes the only shelter left. To see today's animals not as background figures moving through human time, but as living participants in the same old exchange of soil, water, plants, breath, and future. This does not require fear. It requires humility. It requires the calm honesty to admit what we know, what we do not know, and what the evidence can still teach. Fossils do not give us the whole past, but they widen the present. Footprints do not speak in words, but they show that a body once moved where silence now rests. Preserved traces do not bring the giant sloth back, but they remind us that the world has already lost forms of life that once seemed ordinary. And if ordinary things can vanish, then ordinary attention matters. A riverbank matters before it is famous. A patch of forest matters before it is gone. A species matters before it becomes a skeleton behind glass. The old giant sloth cannot walk back into the valley. Its footsteps belong to another arrangement of earth. But the question it leaves is still alive in our time. If a world can lose something so large, so slow, and so deeply woven into its ground, what quiet forms of life around us are beginning to disappear before we have truly learned how to see them?